Well, good morning. I think in this room there are different kinds of people. There are some of you who, when it comes to being in the wild, your idea of being in the wild is a fifth wheel or a cabin. Others of you are the tent people. Where are the fifth wheel cabin people? Where are you? All right. Great. Where are the tent people? Woo! We got a lot of tent people. I think there's also, in the room, there's also flatlanders and there's elevation people, people who like a good climb. Where are the flatlanders, okay? We got flatlanders. Where are the elevation people? I am an elevation person. So a couple of weeks ago, we were in Lisbon. Carolyn and I were in Lisbon. And when we found out where our Airbnb was, I couldn't have been more excited. It was dragging the suitcases up a road like this. And it was like, this is awesome. Carolyn, she was not so into that. She's more of a flatlander. Well, if you've ever been to a place called Masada in Israel on the edge of the Dead Sea, this is a sizable climb. This is a pretty incredible place. I've been there twice. I've hiked Masada twice. And as soon as you do, you realize that the sun doesn't just shine on Masada, it attacks Masada. I mean, there are no trees to get any shelter. There's no grass or lawn. There's no canopies or buildings. There's no lemonade stands at the top. It is just it's sort of like an abandoned ship in the middle of a desert. It's a really remarkable place with the walls being 1,000 feet high. Now, the background of Masada is really quite fascinating. King Herod, about 35 years before Christ, was so paranoid that he was going to get assassinated or attacked or some sort of political overthrow that he took over this plateau on the edge of the Dead Sea and he made a fortress out of it. He had these lush, very beautiful, luxurious palaces. There was all sorts of amenities up there. There were storehouses, there were barracks, there were bathhouses, and there was an ingenious water system that could allow a couple of hundred people to live a couple of years without ever having to go get water. It was something else. But 100 years after he built this, a bunch of Jewish rebels took over and they made this their fortress. 960 men, women, and children kind of took siege of this fortress. And this was the last of the Jewish rebellion against the Romans. The Romans wanted to crush them, so they began by building a wall around Masada so that nobody could escape. And then they cut off all the food supply and water supply. And then they built an ingenious ramp up one side. And finally, after months and months and months of siege, they actually stormed Masada. And when they got there, they thought they were going to find 960 men, women, and children to take into slavery. But when they got there, if you know the story, everybody had chosen death over slavery. Well, Masada kind of crumbled after that. The desert winds blew in and the sand began to pile up and the roofs collapsed, the walls collapsed. The places on the floor that used to be where people were living and playing games and cooking just became all a pile of rubble, and the desert took over. And it buried something. It buried something underneath all of that dust and ruins. What it buried lay there throughout the rise of the Roman Empire, and through 500 years later when the Roman Empire collapsed. What was buried there lay there throughout the Crusades, 1,000 years after the revolt, century after century. In fact, it lay there buried, nobody even knew it was there, for 2,000 years. Until 1963, archaeologists began digging around in Herod's palace area, and they came across an ancient little box. And they got so excited. They could begin to imagine what kind of gold or silver or coins or jewelry might be in this box that was in Herod's palace. But when they opened it, all they found was some dry, shriveled up date seeds. Nothing too exciting. I mean, it was still a find. These were from a date tree that used to be all over the region and had gone extinct about 1,800 years ago. So they took them and they very carefully put them into a university science lab. They examined them, and then they put them up on a shelf for another 40 years. Finally, in 2005, a doctor named Sarah Salin wondered, I wonder what would happen if we actually planted one of those date seeds. And everybody said, well, I can tell you what's going to happen. Nothing, because date seeds that are 2,000 years old, they're dead. And so sure enough, they soaked them in water, they carefully fertilized them, they tended them very carefully. And then on January 25th, 2005, Dr. Salone put the seed back in the ground and waited. Waited a week, kept looking, nothing. Waited 2 weeks, kept looking, nothing. Waited 3 weeks, nothing. And that's what you would expect from 2,000-year-old dead seeds. And then just after the third week, the ground cracked, and a little tiny shoot began to emerge from the ground. It was pale green. It was pale and sickly looking and unimpressive, but it was alive. It was incredible. Somehow, through the centuries of darkness and crushing rubble and desert heat and winds, against all odds, and then sitting on a shelf for another 40 years, somehow something inside of this seed had survived. So they named this little tree Methuselah, after the oldest person in the Bible. But Methuselah wouldn't stop growing. It grew 6 inches, a foot, 6 feet. It got taller. Eventually, they had to put it outside, and they planted it outside, and it began to flower. And 6 years ago, they discovered that Methuselah is a male palm tree, a male extinct palm tree, and they mated it with another ancient female palm tree, and they managed to harvest dates, real dates. The seed buried. I mean, think about this. The seed buried back in the time of Christ somehow had generated and produced fruit in our generation. For nearly 2,000 years, everything said to the seed, it's over for you. You're dead. But buried inside that seed was some life. Church, welcome to the last of our series called Church in the Wild. We've worked our way through over the last number of weeks the wonder of untamed grace, the force of untamed truth. We've studied the irresistible nature of untamed hospitality and the rules of God's untamed power. And this week we wrap up our series as we come together, and we want to stand beside this tree called Methuselah because it's such a great picture of untamed hope. Now, even as I say the word hope, you got to acknowledge that hope has a problem. In fact, hope as a concept has all sorts of problems. Problem number one, hope has become wishful thinking. Many of us, we use the word hope, and you'll catch yourself even the rest of today probably using the word. I hope it doesn't rain and ruin my plans. I hope Team Canada wins their World Cup match. It would be incredible. I hope I get that job that I've been applying for. For many of us, hope is like this idea. We have no clue what's going to happen, but we've crossed our fingers and we just it's wishful thinking. We're just hoping in something. Problem number two is that hope has become passive. We often use hope in the context of, well, I've done everything I humanly possibly can do, and now all there is to do is hope. It becomes a very passive sort of experience. Problem number three is that hope has become naive, especially in the last 10 or 15 years. In a world of cynicism and skepticism, people who have hope are often accused of ignoring reality. They're ignoring reality and they're embracing a sentimental, dreaming kind of naivety that against all odds they're hoping. Hope has become synonymous with the power of positive thinking, as if our minds can actually make something happen. Not only has hope become housebroken and domesticated, it's experienced shrinkflation. It's gotten smaller in the last couple of decades. Not only has hope been reduced to campaign slogans and political slogans, but problem number four is that hope has become disconnected from Jesus. Actually, it's far worse than that. If you ask somebody, the first word that comes to mind when they hear the word Christian, it most often is not the word hope. In fact, for nearly 20 years, researchers have been doing exactly that. They've been asking people who are not part of a church, who are not part of faith, just out in the streets. They've been asking normal North Americans and saying, hey, when you hear the word Christian, what's the first word that comes to mind? And it is a sobering list of words. Judgmental, hypocritical, too political, intolerant, homophobic, racist, hateful, narrow-minded. Now, some of those perceptions are unfair, some are exaggerations. A bunch of them we have to admit that as a Christian culture we have earned over the last couple of decades. But that list raises a very interesting question that we need to wrestle with. Why isn't hope topping the list? Why isn't hope topping the list or even on the list? Why isn't hope one of the words that we find? I mean, think about it for a second. We are a people that gather every week, and we have in the core of our being this belief in the resurrection. We believe that God redeems things. We believe that grace and love can cover a multitude of sins. We believe that forgiveness is possible. We believe that marriages can be healed. We believe that people who are hopelessly addicted can actually experience recovery and freedom. We believe in prodigals coming home. We believe that even death itself does not get the last word. So why is it that we are not identified as the most hope-filled people in the world? How is it that all these other words stick to us, but hope doesn't even make the list? Well, I think one of the reasons is because that even as Christ followers, we don't entirely understand biblical, godly hope. We don't understand how untamed and radical and revolutionary and explosively powerful biblical hope is. In fact, if you've walked in here today and you kind of have this idea that, yeah, hope is like wishful thinking, it's a bit naive, it makes for a good slogan, but it's out of touch with reality, then I'm going to tell you, you're going to be shocked and you are going to be surprised, because what the Bible says about hope is so different than that. And I think when we finally grasp what the scriptures talk about hope, maybe we will begin to be known as a people, first and foremost, as a people of hope. I want to roll out for you 3 surprises I found about hope. Surprise number 1, God's hope is an anchor. Now, we've read this verse often at Riverwood. This happens to be one of Carolyn's and my favorite verses, Hebrews 6:19. We have this hope as an anchor for the soul, firm and secure. Many of you know that last summer, Carolyn and I ended up buying an old sailboat with a very big hole in it. And we ended up fixing up this sailboat and putting it in the water. We sailed Lake of the Woods 4 or 5 times and had an incredible time sailing this old boat. And then on one of the trips, I took a couple of guys out. And we went out sailing for a couple of nights, and it was great. We were sailing down the lake, down this channel, and we rounded the corner around an island, and the lake just opened up, and you could see everything. And when the lake opened up and we could see everything, what we saw was a huge, dark, ominous cloud coming our way. In front of that cloud, the temperature dropped. You could see a line in the water where the wind was churning up the waves, and you could see a wall of rain that was ready to come our way. We knew that going down this lake, this open part of the lake, that there was no way that we were going to avoid and get out of the way of this thing. So I had some decisions to make, and as an inexperienced sailor, I had to make them fairly quickly. So I told my crew, okay, we're going to sail between those 2 islands. And so we began to sail towards those 2 islands. When we got between the 2 islands, I told my crew to take the sails down, wrap them up, batten down the hatches. And as they were scrambling to get all of the gear put away, I pulled out the anchor. I untangled the rope. I threw the anchor overboard. I let the line run for a little bit. I felt it grab onto a rock at the bottom of the lake, and I tied it off onto the boat. And then I went below deck to join them. We covered up the boat, and we were nice and dry. We sat down there, and we talked, and we had some drinks, and we had some snacks, and we had a great time. But then the storm hit, and that boat began to rock. The wind began to blow. The rain began to hammer that little boat. And the fact is that we were down below deck, and we weren't worried at all because we were anchored. In fact, the anchor that day became the hero of the story. But I want you to think about that anchor for a moment. That anchor did not get rid of the storm. That anchor did not cause it to stop blowing or the waves to churn or for the rain to hammer our little boat. What that anchor did was it kept us from drifting downwind and becoming broken on the rocks. And that's exactly the picture that the writer of Hebrews wants us to see. We have this hope that is an anchor for our soul. Hope doesn't get rid of the storm. Hope doesn't get rid of the rain. What it does is it holds us steady while we're in the middle of the raging storm. I think when it comes to hope, many of us kind of have this idea that hope really comes to life when circumstances get better. That when the problem goes away, when things become less intense, when things start going right, I'll experience peace and hope. But the reality is that Jesus says, no, I'm going to give you an anchor that holds you in the middle of the storm. The anchor is meant for the middle of the storm. Surprise number 2, God's hope isn't hope for something. Now, this is where I think we get the biggest surprise. And if we really peel away our own personal hope, this is where some things begin to come to light, because it changes everything about what we think about hope. You see, I think many of us, most of us, me for sure, I am constantly battling this tendency to put my hope in outcomes. I tie my hope to outcomes all the time. You might be thinking, I hope I get that promotion. I hope the results come back negative from the doctor. I hope our marriage makes it through this season. I hope we can have a baby. I hope the business turns the corner. I hope my kids come back to Jesus. There's nothing wrong with any of those hopes. In fact, God invites us to pray with faith for things like that. However, the problem comes when we begin to put our hope in the outcome of those circumstances. But here is the shocking truth about hope that many of us have never quite figured out in our real life. We can't put our hope in outcomes. You can't put your hope in outcomes because biblical hope is not anchored to an outcome. It's not anchored to a miracle. It's not anchored to something going well for you. It's anchored to a person. Scripture is so clear on this, and it's so simple. Psalm 42:5, put your hope in God. That's where the hope goes. That's what you anchor to. Put your hope in God. Not your hope in an answer, not your hope in a breakthrough, not your hope in a miracle, not your hope in a job promotion. You put your hope in God. Romans 15:13. May the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace as you trust him, so that you may overflow with hope by the power of the Holy Spirit. Did you catch that? He isn't just the God who gives some hope. It says that he is the God of hope. And that means that if you put your hope in your health and your health fails, then your hope is going to fail. If you attach your hope to your finances and your finances collapse, your hope and your faith is going to collapse. If your hope is attached to a person, and that person or that circumstance or that experience lets you down, your hope is going to come crushing down. But when your hope is fastened to Jesus, I can tell you from personal experience in different settings in my life and for the people that I've walked with, I've watched people who have lost their job. I've watched people who have lost their health. I've watched people who have lost their money, lost their plans, lost their house, lost their dreams, but they still didn't lose their hope because their hope wasn't attached to outcomes. The hope wasn't attached to circumstances or things. This is a massive perspective shift, which actually requires us to time out just for a minute and say, how do you practically shift your perspective from a place where you're putting your hope in outcomes and circumstances to where you can actually put your hope where it needs to be, anchored to God? How do you actually practically do that? Well, I think the Bible is incredibly clear, but so simple in how you do that. You remember. You remember. Throughout the Bible, God calls his people who have lost hope to a new hope. And it's really interesting. Often in these situations, he does not give them new information. He doesn't give them new revelations. Instead, he goes back and calls them to remember. He reminds them of who he is and who he has always been. I am the God who brought you out of Egypt. I am the God who will never leave you and forsake you. I am the God who parted the sea in front of you. I am the God who fed you in the wilderness. I am the God who will never leave you alone. Why does he call us to remember? Because hope grows when we remember God's faithfulness. When you remember the faithfulness of God over the centuries. In other words, when you're tempted to panic, we can't just take that anchor and throw it into the muddy waters of hopeful, wishful thinking, but instead we anchor it to the rock of God's character. God is still good. God is still faithful. God is still sovereign. God is still with you no matter what storm in life you experience. And when you're tempted to give up, you need to remember God's character. You need to remember God's faithfulness, and you need to remember God's character. He hasn't changed his mind. He's not wishy-washy. He hasn't broken his word. He hasn't lost control. When you're tempted to believe that the story is over, you need to remember God's character, you need to remember God's faithfulness, and you need to remember God's track record. Not only in the scriptures, which we have every page is of God's track record of his faithfulness and his character, but also in your own life. How many times has God made a way for you when there was no way? How many times has God provided for you at the very last moment? How many times has God answered a need of your heart or your life? How many times has God been faithful to you even when you couldn't see what he was doing? Listen, to actually make this work practically, you need to discipline your faith to look back at God's character, at God's track record, at who God is and what he has done in your life and in Scripture. You need to look back with your faith so that your hope can look forward. And it emboldens your hope. Surprise number 3. God's hope grows best in impossible places. Romans 4:18 says something that sounds so contradictory and doesn't even make sense, actually. It says this: against all hope, Abraham in hope believed. How does that make sense? Against all hope, Abraham in hope believed. I believe that this verse brings with it an incredible insight into the nature of hope in God. God's hope is born precisely in the circumstances that seem most impossible and don't even make sense. You know, one of the remarkable stories that emerged from World War II was of a Jewish neurologist, psychologist. You probably heard his name before, Viktor Frankl. Viktor Frankl was born in 1905 to a Jewish family in Vienna. He grew up, he got educated. Before World War II, he was living a life that most people would deem to be a dream life. His dreams are coming true. He was a brilliant physician in Vienna. He'd fallen in love, and he married Tilly, the love of his life. He researched, his research was gaining attention. He was getting published. He was working on ideas about humanity and how to find the meaning and purpose in life. And then, even as World War II was beginning to come closer to him, he managed to get a visa to immigrate to the United States, which was an answer to prayer. It was remarkable because now he was going to be able to avoid all the horrors of Nazi Europe at the time. But just before they left, him and Tilly were talking and realized that it was unthinkable for him to leave while his aging parents would have to deal with this Nazi threat. So in a moment that didn't even make sense, he tore up the visa and said, no, we're staying. Well, a short time later, the Nazis captured the city he was in. They captured him and his family. The young doctor was arrested, stripped of his name. He became prisoner 119-104. His clothes were taken away. His family was taken away. All his research was taken away. The manuscripts to the book he was working on was taken away. Everything vanished. Everything, his dignity, his future, food and food security, everything was taken away. Eventually, he would end up in 4 Nazi concentration camps, including Auschwitz. And he had no clue what was happening to his family and those he loved. It turns out that in the concentration camps, his father died. His mother and his brother were murdered in the gas chambers, and his wife Tilly died without him even knowing it at the time. Everything this man loved and had built was taken away. Imagine waking up every day wondering, am I going to make it to sunset? Or is this going to be my last day alive? Imagining wondering every day, what happened to your mom and your dad and your wife and your family, and having no clue what happened to them. Imagine every day watching the disease and the health and the barbaric experiments and people disappearing and the cruelty, just unthinkable cruelty that was happening all around you. Well, to make a long story much shorter, a few years later he got out. And he began reflecting upon his experiences, dealing with his losses. And as he reflected on his experiences, something very curious came to mind. He began to remember the people who were in the camps, who were healthy. They were strong. They didn't seem to have any physical problems, really, and yet they were the people who seemed to shrivel up and end up dying. And then he remembered some of the most emaciated and starved people who were going through horrible situations. They were the weakest and the most vulnerable, but somehow these people managed to survive the camps. And as a psychiatrist, he began to wrestle with this and wondered, how is it the strong people didn't survive and the weak people, many of them, did survive? And what he discovered was this. The determining factor was whether that person still believed that there was meaning beyond the barbed wire. If that person had it in their head and heart that there was meaning and life beyond the barbed wire, it seemed that they survived. And after the war, Frankl wrote these famous words that are now go all around the world. Everything can be taken from a man, but one thing. The last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. What he stumbled on was actually a truth of Scripture that has been there for thousands of years. Hope isn't manufactured by circumstances. Hope transcends circumstances. That's what hope does. It's not connected to outcomes. It's not connected to circumstances. It's not connected to a doctor's diagnosis or good news or bad news. Hope transcends circumstances. Hope understands that there is meaning and life beyond the barbed wire, beyond the devastating loss, beyond the failure, beyond the diagnosis, even beyond death itself. And that's why in the Scriptures, we read of these remarkable people that lived out their hope. That's why in the Bible, Joseph could trust God, even though he was thrown in the bottom of a pit and ended up in a prison. That's why Moses could stand on the edge of the Red Sea trying to lead this million people to freedom with the Pharaoh's armies coming down on him. That's why Gideon could go to war with his head held high, even though God had taken his army of 10,000 and whittled them down to just 300. That's why David could run towards Goliath. While everybody else was running away, David runs towards Goliath, even though Goliath is impossibly big. That's why Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego could walk into the fiery furnace and not bow their knee to the king. That's why Daniel could sleep peacefully in the lion's den. That's why Paul could sing in prison. And that's why Stephen could pray for those who would throw stones and end up killing him. They weren't denying the barbed wire impossibilities of their circumstances, but they were declaring that there is something beyond the circumstances. There's something beyond the outcomes. There's something beyond the barbed wire. Church, this is what makes us so different from the world. This is what I wish the world would see in us. Not that list of other characteristics, but rather that they would see the hope that is exuding out of us. Not because life is easier for us, not because we've tapped in and figured out how to make miracles work, not because we somehow have managed to calm all the storms in life. What makes us different is that we have a hope inside of us that the world cannot explain and cannot take away. And that's why in the early days of our Christian faith, the Roman Empire could not figure out these Christians and wanted to kill them. Because when the plagues came, Christians didn't run, but they stayed to help people. When persecution came, they began singing praises to God. When death came, they grieved, but they did not grieve as people with no hope. They believed that there was something beyond the barbed wire, something beyond the prison, something beyond the furnace, something beyond the lion's den, something beyond the hospital bed, something beyond the cross, something beyond the grave itself. And that changed everything. For nearly 2,000 years, a seed that had been buried in the dust and the heat lay there. And the dust and the desert said to that seed, "You are so done. There is no hope for you. No hope. We've taken all of your life away." Logic said it was over. Science said it was over and put those seeds on a shelf. But against the dust of time, against logic, against science, life began to spring out of those seeds. It doesn't even make any sense. And the reality is that some of us today are in a place where we feel like the life has been sucked out of us. Like we have nothing left inside of us. We feel like we've been buried. We feel like we have been forgotten, like we've been dried out, like we've been beat down, like our best days are behind us. But I want to say this. If God can take seeds that have been dead for 2,000 years and spring life out of those seeds, then don't tell me that God cannot repair and bring that marriage back together and restore it. If God can bring life out of seeds that have been dead for 2,000 years, don't tell me that God can't reach that loved one that you've been praying for 10 years. If God can bring life out of 2,000-year-old dead seeds, then don't tell me that God can't heal that heart or heal that body or redeem that failure. Don't tell me that your story is finished, because God specializes in putting life into what appears to be dead. Church, God's hope isn't optimism about tomorrow. It's absolute confidence because of the one who sits on the throne today. And if we could just change our perspective, and if we could just be in a place where we embrace God's hope for ourselves and we live it out, maybe the people in our lives, maybe the people around us, when they hear the word Christian or they think of our faith, maybe the first thing they'd think of would be, wow, those people are so full of hope. And whatever they have, I need.